introduction.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the Rav for giving me the opportunity to do the shiurim. It's going to be a series of shiurim on the Halachot of Tola'im, the Halachot of finding insects and various types of food, drinks, beverages, all types of organic and non-organic material. And it's going to be a three-part lecture. Today, what we're going to speak about is finding insects in the New York City water, something that was considered a controversial topic for approximately the past 16 years, since the Pesach of 2004, I believe. It's still an ongoing debate regarding the permissibility or forbidden nature of it. So today we're going to spend the first part of this lecture series describing problems or solutions regarding finding insects in New York City water. The next part of the series is going to be talking about finding insects in types of produce such as fruits and vegetables and how a person is able to take care of that and be mevatel these types of isurim. And finally, the third part and the final part of it will be talking about finding insects in types of living materials such as fish and in animals and in dairy products and things of the sort. And finally, the best part for us is the discussion regarding spontaneous generation and how the Torah's perspective on it will coincide with scientific understanding today. So now, to start moving. The Torah says the following. It's in Parshat Shmini, in Sefer Yikra, Perek Aleph, Halachot and Yud. It says the following: Et zeh tochel mikol asher b'mayim, kol asher bo senapir v'kaskesed, b'mayim v'yamim v'nechalim otam tochelu. The Torah talks about types of swarming creatures that are found inside of the water. So essentially, types of fish and the simanim, the signs of fish that are permitted. The Torah says anything that you find alive in the water, which has two signs. The famous signs, you could ask people, what are the signs of a kosher fish? It has senapir v'kaskesed, which means it has fins and scales. Anything that possesses these two signs, of course, assuming that the scales are not adhering to the body itself, but could even be easily removed, that is considered a kosher species, which the Torah has permitted. Then the Torah comes and tells us something else in the very next pasuk. If you have anything that does not have fins or scales, or a combination of two, only has one of them or has none of them, in the rivers and in the streams, he says anything that swarms inside of the water, anything else that's considered alive in the water, it's considered sheketz for you, meaning it's a repulsive nature to you. That is an abomination, it cannot be consumed. And if a person consumes such shkatzim, he has violated a certain amount of isurim. Now, does anybody know how many isurim applies when a person eats what's known as a sheket samayim, or sheret samayim? Forbidden? 4, exactly. 4 types of isurim. We're going to see that B'ezrat Hashem for the next part of the series. When we talk about finding insects and types of produce, we're going to show that there's actually, depending on the type of insect that's found, it would differ as to how many isurim that they come. And the general understanding is as follows, that anything that grows from the water has 4 isurim. If it's an insect that's on the ground, it has 5 isurim. And if it has something that flies, it's 6 isurim. So the higher level you go, you actually get higher amount of isurim, 1 per. So B'ezrat Hashem, we'll get to that when we go into the next aspect and how we learn this halachot. But today, sufficient for us to know is regarding water. So now, if you look at Yoreh Deah, in Pei Dalet Halach Aleph, we find Malan saying the following interesting concept, and he basically tells us something that we intuitively would not have thought. We tend to assume that all types of insects are forbidden. Every type of insect and all species of insects in the world are forbidden because the Torah says insects are bad. However, that is not accurate. That is not accurate. He goes on saying that there are certain types of insects, and this is very interesting. He starts the halachot of insects telling us there are certain insects that actually are permitted. They actually are permitted. Because if you look in the pasuk that we just saw, it says that anything that grows in water, any insect that grows in water, that develops in water, that's habitat is water, is problematic. But clearly, if the problem is that if it's in nechalim or yamim, if it's in streams, if it's in rivers, if it's in oceans, that's an issue. But seemingly there are exceptions to this rule. And he says the following. In the very first halacha, if you have shratzim, you have these insects that grow inside of water, but the water is not from natural water. It doesn't come from the river, it doesn't come from oceans, but rather it's found in a kli or in a bore. If it's in a pit or if it's in a vessel. If it grows in a cup. If it grows inside of a pit in the ground that a person dug up. We're talking about caves and other types of places in which there is no natural source of water that's connected to it, meaning there is no connection to a river, there's no connection to a natural body of water. So assuming we're talking about, let's say, rainwater comes, and it starts filling up a pit. And then you have a fly coming and lays its eggs over there. And then a couple days later you find that there are flies inside of that pit of water. He says, mutarim. These are actually permitted. A person is allowed to consume those types of insects because it did not come from a natural body of water. When the Torah forbade it, let's just go back to that pasuk, and I should tell the people who are going to be watching this on whatever website is being posted that we are having this done as a PowerPoint. So the Bezat Hashem, the PowerPoint will be posted up along with the lecture itself. So those who want to follow have the opportunity to do so as well. So just going back to the pasuk itself, it says anything that's found b'nechalin u'bayamim. If it's found in rivers, it's found in streams. Meaning that if it's not in a natural body of water, if it doesn't develop a natural body of water, examples would be in types of water tanks, or in a cup, or in a bore, in a cave, or in pits. All those things are permitted for consumption. It's a novel idea. But he starts off those halachot saying that there is a permitted nature to it. It's not always forbidden. And we're going to see that this is going to be a common theme throughout the series of lectures as we continue. So he says, Mutarim afal pi she'en lahem sinavir kaskesen. Even though they do not have fins and scales, nonetheless these are permitted because they don't come from a natural body of water. They have no connection to a natural body of water, and therefore it's not a problem from the Torah's perspective, and the Chachamim never made any gzara on them. Therefore a person is technically allowed to go inside of a pit, and he's allowed to dunk his head inside of it and start drinking from the water. And he should not be concerned that perhaps he's going to be swallowing something that might go inside of his mouth. Maybe there is some sort of insect inside. The Torah says that's not a problem. So therefore, should a person be concerned? No, because even if it goes into his mouth, that's not an Isur D'oraita. And the Ramah says, interestingly enough, but what a person is not allowed to do, is, let's say you have a pit of water, you have a water tank that has no natural body of water in which it's connected to. A person is allowed to drink directly from the pit, directly from the tank. What he's not allowed to do is take a cup, put it into the tank, and start drinking it yourself. Why would that be the case? What's the idea for here? And what we're going to see based on the next slide is that the following idea. It's based on what Malan says over here. If it left its place, left its place of origin, it left its natural environment, its habitat, it becomes a sumi d'oraita automatically. Meaning the only time the Torah permitted these types of insects is as long as it developed inside its natural habitat, which is not connected to a natural body of water. Once it leaves from the Gzerat HaKatuv, from the pasuk itself, it teaches us that it no longer is permitted. It now has a new status as a forbidden creature. And this we're going to see B'ezrat Hashem in the next series. We're going to talk about why this becomes an interesting idea, especially when we talk about the idea of what a bria is and specific halachic nafkaminot regarding these aspects. He says, gives an example. Thank you very much. And he gives an example. He says, let's say you have a cup of water, and in this cup of water, this is where the insect developed. It started its life over there. Meaning, a fly came, dropped some of the larvae inside, and it went and developed, became what it was, and now we find it swimming inside of this cup of water. As long as it remains inside of the cup of water, it is permitted. More than that, even if it leaves the cup of water, meaning it leaves the water itself, but it's still found in the inner part of the cup, it's still considered fine. So if you have a cup and it's still on the inner wall of it, it's still considered its natural habitat because we do assume that some sort of motion is going to be occurring. But he says the following. If it's going to be asfat klimi bachutz, if it's going to be on the outside of the cup, meaning that it goes along the wall of the cup, we're going to see a picture right now. If it goes along the wall of the cup, and it goes to the outside surface from the rim to the outer wall, even though they might return back into the water, it becomes asur. Meaning, once it leaves, even if it comes back to its natural habitat, it already retains, it has what's called a shem chal isur alav, that there's the idea of a isur calling upon it. Therefore, even if it returns to its natural habitat, it is forbidden. But if we see the insect inside of the cup, and we don't know whether it left or not. We know it's there currently, but we have no idea whether it actually left. Well, what do we assume? Do we assume that it left and came back, or do we assume that it always stayed? we would normally say, well, it's a Sefek Doraita, right? There's a doubtful matter regarding Isur Doraita, and generally we say Sefek Doraita L'chumra. However, he doesn't paskin like that, and he says, he says, we're not concerned that it left. Even though it's a suffix where it left, we assume that since it's in its natural habitat, normally things don't leave the natural habitat because that's where they thrive. We have good suspicion to assume that it never left. Because if it left, why would it return? Clearly, the animal or the insect in question wants to be there, so therefore there is no concern. Out of reasonable doubt, we assume that it's still kosher. Okay, so now this is just a quick diagram of how this is supposed to be. The first two on the left is what's considered permitted situation, whereas the last one is forbidden. So if you look on the very far left, you find an insect that actually grew inside of the cup of water itself. That has a check because since it's in its natural habitat, assuming it grew over there, not that it came inside from the outside, if it actually developed and was there the whole time, it is kosher. The same thing would be true for the middle picture. You can clearly see that it's still on the inside of the cup. It's on the inside of the cup, that's still considered its revitayo, meaning that is its natural habitat. We assume some motion is occurring, that is kosher. However, in the very far right picture, number 3, you see that it already left. It's starting to crawl on the outside. That is forbidden because the outside of the kli is not considered its natural habitat. Meaning that even though the kli itself is one component, we do assume certain parts of the kli is forbidden, certain parts are asur, the outside is asur, the inside is permitted. Now, more so, Malan tells us the following as well, that besides cups, there are other types of containers in which that would also be considered permitted nature. For instance, if you have a pit, if you have a cistern, which is basically a water tank, if you have a cave, in all these 3 situations, there is no natural body of water that's connected to. So since there is no natural body of water, the Torah did not forbid that, because the Torah says, Bayamim uva nechalim. Anything that's considered natural body of water, through which the insect developed, is forbidden, but if it's not connected to one, it's completely separated, and we assume over here that all the water came perhaps from rainwater, right? Most likely from rainwater, there's no natural body of water, therefore that should be permitted. That should be permitted. And the same thing would be true, by the way, if a person took, let's say, water from a natural body of water and then he poured it inside of a pit. If he did that as well, and at that time you know without a shadow of a doubt that there was no developing creatures inside, if you were to find it later on, that would still be permitted because it's no longer connected to the natural body of water. It's all about connection, not to its original source. So therefore, what we find is a number of situations. A cup, a vessel, a cistern, a water tank, a pit, and a cave. Malan says all these situations, insects found inside will be permitted, and the person would not be violating it because the Torah did not forbid it. But then comes the question regarding the issue of Baal Teshekitzu, which basically means that a person is not allowed to do things which are inherently disgusting for the vast majority of the populace. So this is an Isur that's only Isur de Rabbanan. So the Isur de Rabbanan is that if we consume something that is considered repulsive by most people, we violated this Isur Baal Teshekitzu. So the question is regarding the insects. You can tell me the following, that if a person dunks his head into the water pit and drinks the water and he knows for sure there's some insect inside. The insect is kosher from a Torah perspective. But isn't there an Isur of doing something disgusting? I understand from the Torah's perspective it's kosher, but not everything from the Torah's perspective that's kosher is always kosher 100%, even the Rabbanan. Right? That's a general rule of kashrut, that not everything the Torah permits is always permitted all across the board in every situation. So the question is there still an Isur D'Rabbanan? And most people would say, well, I don't consume insects on a normal basis, therefore for you to do so would be violating that Isur, and that would apply in most situations. But, of course, there's always the exception to the rule where a person, for whatever reason, actually enjoys or basically is impartial to eating insects. Such a person has he violated it. And this becomes machloket achronim regarding whether if a person actually does not care whether the insects are being consumed, has he violated it? So there's a question whether it's subjective. According to the Pri Chadash, he says the following. He says that subjective feelings towards the object does play a role. So even though the vast majority of people find it disgusting, but if I find it normal, that is actually not an Isur Baal Teshekitzu because it falls on the subjective appearance of every single individual. Knesset Gdolah disagrees and says, no, if the vast majority of people find it disgusting, we don't care what you think, and therefore for you to do so as well would violate the Isur. Of course, this is Isur de Rabbanan only. We have Machod de Rabbanan, Rav Vadik famous Paskins in his Yechavedat, and also in Yabi Omer that it's only Sefek de Rabbanan. The person were to do so, he hasn't violated because there's what to rely on, and apparently there's this idea, at least according to the Pri Chadash, that subjective feelings do play a role when it comes to the Baal Teshuvah. But according to all opinions, it should be known, just as a side point, that if a person is doing something which is technically accepted by societal norms. For instance, if a person is eating meat, and eating meat for most people is not considered something that's absolutely repulsive. But if he finds it repulsive, if he finds it absolutely disgusting, that it's going to be torturous for him to do it, that is a violation of Baal Teshuvah. Right? Because sometimes subjective feelings do come along when the Isur is involved, but when it comes to permitted, we see something of more of a gray area. Now, why is this important and how does this relate to the New York City water? So there's an interesting story that happens. It happened in the early 2004, right close to the time in which the Passover Seder was being held. Story goes, I believe this is the accurate story because this is how it's brought up by a number of sources. They say that there was a person who bought maror. It was romaine lettuce he bought from, I believe it was Gush Katif, so it was still held under Israeli territory at the time. There was a plant that was producing maror in great quantities, and this plant was apparently known to have absolutely 100% bug-free romaine lettuce. That was what they were selling.
So they say.
Right? So that was the point. So what happened? A person, when he wanted to buy these because, I don't know if he was Sephardi or not, but he used the romaine lettuce to use as maror. And what he did was he started washing the romaine lettuce, and then he saw that there was a bug over there. And then he called the company up and says, listen, you apparently advertise that you have bug-free lettuce, whereas I just found one and therefore this is false advertisement, I want my money back, yada, 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 right? Now, they asked him a question. Did you wash the lettuce? And he said, yes, I washed the lettuce. So they said, maybe the bug came from the water, not necessarily came from the lettuce itself. So therefore there was this idea that maybe there's bugs in NYC water that apparently is visible, but it's not distinguishable. This happened in early 2004, and this became subject to much controversy, and it's been brought down to the leading poskim of the time. Just to name a few, there's much more than what I've listed. I only listed 4 because these are some of the biggest 4 that have been talking about this issue. It's from Rav Eliashiv, Rav Scheinberg, Rav David Feinstein Shlita, and also Rav Belsky, Alav Shalom. They talked about this issue, whether NYC water has any problematic aspects to it, and they disagreed greatly. There's great disagreement, and we're going to see today what exactly is the disagreement based on. So the majority felt that there is a concern regarding the NYC water. Rav Belsky seems to be the only posek, the authoritative posek, that held that there is no issue whatsoever. So in order to appreciate it, we have to actually look at the facts of why and how this actually plays a role. So in order to do so, we have to understand how New York City water actually comes when it comes into our faucets, where the point of origin comes from. So essentially, in New York City water, we get it from outside sources, places towards upstate New York, past Westchester, in Delaware, in the Catskills, so on and so forth. There are a number of aqueducts that are actually passing water from those regions, and they go and they funnel their way inside until they reach a point in Westchester County in which that's going to be the biggest debate possible regarding this issue. So essentially what we have...
I just want to point something out, that until a certain point, they used to have the Brooklyn Water Company and the New York Water Company. Until a certain point, locally, they used to take water from local wells. And therefore, that was not a problem. That's why you see many neighborhoods in Queens and places like this that they have water tanks and those water towers. Once they connected all of New York like this, the problem became more of an issue because there's no local supply of water. So that's more recent of a problem.
Okay, so now there's basically 2 watersheds, and I'm going to explain to you what a watershed actually is, in which all the water from New York City comes from. They're known as the Catskill Delaware watershed, which basically Catskill Delaware, they merge into one. That's on the left side of the Hudson River. On the right side, immediately to the east to it, is known as a Coda watershed. And what a watershed essentially is, the entire world is a watershed. It just means a point of place in which water is slumping down from where we are into the nearest body of water. Basically, where we're currently standing, there's water underneath in the ground, correct? Now all the water over there eventually has to settle somewhere. Where exactly is all the water going to? So we say the watershed of our streets is eventually going to lead to a lake. The lake is going to lead to a river. The river is going to lead to a larger river, and then it's going to make to branch into larger and larger rivers, essentially until it goes to the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, any of the oceans. That is considered a watershed, any point in which the water is going down. So now you have two watersheds. You have the Catskill, Delaware, you have the Croton on the right of the Hudson River. So those watersheds, they basically bring down all the waters through various aqueducts, and they merge in a point in Westchester County. Okay? Now, Westchester County, I actually circled it for you in the red inside. It's a place that's known as Kensico Reservoir. Basically, a reservoir is just essentially a huge pit of water that's containing, billions of gallons in order for it to be distributed once appropriate measures are done to clear it out. So what we're going to see is that the vast majority of water that we have in New York City ends up in Kensico Reservoir, and from there it's distributed to the rest of the 5 boroughs. The only exception to that is the Croton watershed. We're going to see, the Catskill, Delaware watershed, and then there's the Croton watershed. Catskill, Delaware watershed, all of their water comes down to Kensico, whereas the Croton watershed it bypasses it and actually goes from a direct aqueduct from Westchester County into New York City, and therefore it doesn't bypass through Kensico itself. Now, which one has the majority? So it really depends on the time of year you're actually looking at. According to most sources, 90% of New York City water ends up in Kensico, and then from there it comes down to us. 10% of it just goes through the Croton aqueduct down to New York City. So what we're going to see right now is that the biggest problem is that all of the insects that we're going to be discussing today is the ones that were found in Kensico. So since 90% of the water comes from Kensico, you're going to assume that that's going to be the biggest issue because it's such a large majority. Now, the type of insects that were found. So the insects that were found is part of a group that's known as the copepods. Again, it's known as copepods. And they've been found to be originating in the Kensico Reservoir and ending up in the New York City sinks. Now, why were they found in the sinks? I'm going to just give you some ideas that is brought down by New York City foodpolicy.org. It gives us a number of ideas that's brought down. It says the following. New York City is one of the few places in the United States which does not require filtered water because apparently it has the highest grade of drinkable water out there. Therefore, legally, there's no necessity for the city to actually do so. More than that, filtering the water would cost the city up to $1 million per day, $365 million a year. Okay, so within a few years, you're getting over $1 billion essentially. Why copepods are there to begin with? They were actually placed there intentionally because there was larvae of mosquitoes that was going to be a pollutant to the water, so therefore they instituted placing these copepods dafka in order to actually eat them. So it's part of a healthy ecosystem essentially for these copepods to be there. And what's most fascinating is in this website, NYCfoodpolicy.org, it says that copepods are not kosher. So clearly they're one side of this debate. It's very interesting that they actually posted it. If you actually go on there, you'll see it's not kosher. So now, let's just go to a little facts. We said that 90% of New York City water comes from Kensico. Now, over there I wrote 94%. The reason I said 94% is because the newest research says it's 94. If you look through anything before 2017, it always gives the number 90, 90, 90, 90 through all the research. 2017 apparently has 94. Now, further research I have actually looked into says that sometimes the water that comes from the other aqueducts, right, the one that does not go through Kensico, sometimes New York City uses up to 30% of that water depending upon how much rainfall there is, if it's a time of drought or relative drought as it were. So these numbers tend to shift, but essentially we're using usually the number of 90% because that's been the most common figure. I don't know why it's been jumped to 94. Maybe there's been a shortage from the other reservoir. I don't know. I don't know that much to exactly tell you, but the standard number is 90. What exactly is the range of size? What are we talking about? How big are these copepods? So they range in the size of 1 to 2 millimeters when they are adults. So when they're larvae, they're much smaller than that, but eventually they grow to 1 to 2 millimeters. A person doesn't know what a millimeter is. A millimeter is a 25th of an inch, 1/25th of an inch, so 2 millimeters would be a 12th. You can only imagine how small that is. It's very small. Now, it is noteworthy to note that the copepods that are found dead by the time they come to the faucet. So the ones that are actually found inside of the sinks, they're not alive. The reason they're not alive is because they're sprayed with many things. One of the things is chlorine, the other one's fluorine, and also they place in UV light amongst other sulfides as well. So they cannot tolerate that. They die, they don't disintegrate, but they are dead by the time they actually leave the reservoirs. And this becomes a crucial point to understand. By the time they leave the reservoirs, they're already dead. It's not like they travel in some way, they die. They die in the reservoir itself because of the chlorination that happens. They thrive. By the time they're ready to leave, chlorination comes, UV light is spread, it dies out, and then that's what ends up being found in the sink apparently. So now, what is the debate hinged on? What are we exactly concerned about? What are we not concerned about? And there are three main points that we have to tackle to see whether there is a concern, maybe not a concern. What are the poskim argue about? Number one, are the insects considered sufficiently visible to be considered an insect which the Torah forbids? When we breathe, every single moment, there are billions of bacteria that are going inside of our mouths constantly. We don't assume that the Torah says that every single microorganism is forbidden because, as the famous expression goes, brought down by the Aruch HaShulchan, Torah was not given to angels.
Or if you have carpets at home, you have dust mites, they're also quite significant.
Right. So, if that's the case, we obviously talking about there's a certain measurement which the Torah says that at this point it's considered sufficiently large enough to be considered an insect. Anything smaller than that would not be. Now everybody agrees that if something is microscopic, meaning that it is invisible to the eye, literally invisible to the eye, it's not a problem. The question is, once a certain degree of visibility is present, what exactly are we dealing with? Is that a problem or not? That's the first point of contention. Number two, what is the status of the Kensico Reservoir? We said 90% of New York City ends up in Kensico, in Westchester County. So if that's the case, what is the data of Kensico? If we remember, we saw in the very first slide, Moran Shulchan Aruch says that certain types of insects are permitted when they're found in bodies of water in which it's natural, not a natural body of water. If they're found in a pit, if they're found in a cup, if they're found in a bore, if they're found in a cistern, all these things are permitted. Question is Kensico being a reservoir, is that considered a pit or not? Because seemingly the purpose of a reservoir is just to contain water, it's not to actually bring from the outside source. The question is, what do we view Kensico as? That's the second, and finally the third is the presence of copepods considered a significant enough problem to pose a concern? What we're going to see is that certain times the Torah does not require us to actually check foods, produce, liquids for insects. And that basically means that if the presence of an insect is so scarce, it's so rare for it to happen, the Torah says that you can basically bypass it and there's no necessity to check it because the chances of it happening are so slim that even the Rabbanan, they said, you know what, if it happens once in a million times, don't even worry about it. Even if it's consumed, it's not an issue, essentially. So, those are the 3 points. Concern number one, sufficient size. Now, the typical human eye, this is based on Nature magazine, says the following. Typical human eye with normal vision can see an object as small as 0.1 millimeter with without the aid of devices. So you could see it, meaning you can only see it, but it does not mean that one can discern, meaning you cannot differentiate the individual parts of the thing itself, of an object of that size. So even though I could see something that's 0.1 millimeter, I could see it as a dot, that doesn't mean that I could differentiate the actual points of it. So when we saw earlier the size of an adult copepod that's ending up in the water, we said it's 1 millimeter. Okay? If a human eye could see 0.1 millimeter, which is a tenth of that, so therefore we assume that there is something that is visible, but the question is it discernible? Can I differentiate the individual parts? That becomes the biggest question that we have. As noted, copepods range between the size of 1-2 millimeters when fully grown, and are assumed to be visible by the human eye, and therefore not subject to the dispensation of the Aruch HaShulchan. Again, Aruch HaShulchan said that only things that are absolutely microscopic is problematic. The question is, how far do we take this to go? What is the debate? Copepods are only discernible when living in the reservoirs as they are alive and swimming, since they have yet to be exposed to the chemical treatment. So if a person were to take a trip to the Kensico Reservoir, you would see little things floating around because they're still considered alive. They're part of the ecosystem. They're an essential part of the ecosystem. They were there placed intentionally, and therefore one would be able to discern at least its movement. Now, halachically speaking, to discern something means you actually have to see the parts, but once you see a thing moving, and we already understand that's an insect, that is considered sufficient. Even though I cannot see the antennas, I cannot see the legs, I cannot see the eyes of the animal, nonetheless, if I see movement, we assume that this is obviously an insect, and therefore that is considered to be sufficient to actually...
Which is very difficult because they're a little bit of like clear side,
Right, so one of the things of the copepods is environmentally speaking, many animals, they tend to camouflage to their environment in order to save themselves from predators. So now copepods, they tend to have a clearer, whitish type of exterior shell. Why they do that? Because water is clear, and therefore by hiding inside, they survive. Which is why finding these copepods makes it much more difficult to do so. Yet again, it's possible to see them, it's not impossible. So the question is, if you just see them, right, but I cannot discern them, is that considered halachically problematic? Now, by the time copepods end up in our faucets, they are visible as small white dots, but not discernible as once living insects because they're no longer alive because of the chemical treatment. Is a concern still composed regardless? Now, Robelsky held that being that copepods have been around since the early 20th century and has never been noticed, let alone it was ingested by Gedolim like Harav Moshe Feinstein, it is clear proof that the Torah was only concerned with discernible insects, not visible insects. Right? This is brought down to Shulchan HaLevi. So basically, Robelsky's point is more of a logical and also theological argument. He says, the Torah only forbade things that I could actually discern clearly what they are. If I see something as a dot, I shouldn't have to assume that every dot is an insect. There's many things out there that would give that impression, but it wouldn't make sense for us to be concerned for everything. And he says more than that, can we believe that a gadol, like on the level of Moshe Feinstein, who lived in New York for many years, was ingesting isurim, and each isur we said is at least four, each kopad would be for a lavim at the very least. That poses a very big theological problem, to assume that gedolim were violating that. And for that reason, Robelsky basically says that cannot be what the Torah forbade. It wouldn't make sense, otherwise you get into both that logical issue as well. Now just to make a little picture over there, this was a actual picture, but it was slightly magnified. I will tell you, I actually wrote down the arrow. It is slightly magnified. It is 10 times magnified. That's what the copepod will look like. Like you can tell, it's clearly like a little white dot that would be found in order to match with its environment. So, on the other hand, those who disagree. So it's based on, interestingly enough, Harav David Feinstein. Why that's interesting is because that's his son. Right? It becomes very interesting to see how this goes. So him, Harav David Feinstein, Harav Hoshel Shachter from Yeshiva University disagree based on the ruling of the Petchei Teshuvah in Peidal Mem He. What does he say over there? Petchei Teshuvah says, he quotes from the Sefer Ben Avraham, which held that as long as an insect is discernible at some point in its life, if it was one time discernible, even if it loses the ability to be discerned later on, it is still asur. So basically meaning the following. If you went to Kensico, you would see them swimming. If you went to the faucet, you would not see them swimming. So therefore, since at some point it was discernible, therefore it has that status forever. And you can follow the logic. If something is asur right now, 10 minutes later or an hour later, we should still assume that it's asur. We wouldn't assume that the isur has left, generally speaking. So that's where the argument is coming from. Harav David Feinstein in a letter to the OU went so far to say that would be true even if the insects were no longer visible. Meaning even if you can't see them, but they're once able to be seen, right, and discerned all the more so, that poses a problem. Now that is an extremely large chumrah. I understand if you tell me that if I cannot tell them apart, but if I can't see them, that's still asur. The OU rejected this position. They said that cannot be the case because that's a chumrah that's just far too difficult for people to cope with and to accept. So most don't agree to that position, but at the very least, they do say that if at one point in its stage it was able to be seen and discerned, even though it cannot no longer be identified from individual parts, it still poses an issue. Concern number 2, Kensico Reservoir. What exactly is the deed? So as we saw above, the Kensico Reservoir is fed water by the aqueducts leaving the Catskill and Delaware watershed. Right, Corsico, which was the other watershed, we said it's only 10% of the water itself, so it's not really significant enough for us to actually worry about that. The water settles there and contains a total volume of 30 billion gallons. It holds 30 billion gallons, with 1.45 billion gallons leaving through aqueducts found 120 feet below the surface level. So about 3% of it on a daily basis is leaving. A little larger than that, about 4% is leaving on a daily basis. Now, 4%, obviously, we talk about water that's being depleted from the bottom, right? It's not like it's going over from the top, but there's pipes and tunnels buried 120 feet underneath which carry the water. So if you're looking at the Kensico, let's say you're actually looking on top of it, right? And you are being told that about 3% of the water is being depleted. From your visual perspective, you don't actually see them. because it's so minute. It's not like 10%, 20% is being depleted. For only 1.45 billion out of 30 billion, you can't actually see from your visual aid that something's actually changing. Now, the Kensigo Reservoir, you have large valves that control the settling and traveling of water depending on necessity to prevent overflowing. So basically there are doors and valves that constantly open and they decide how much is going on a daily basis. But again, the average that goes on a daily basis is only 1.45 billion, which is roughly 4% of the total water volume that's being held. The reservoir is also a habitable ecosystem that we said with many life forms, including copepods, using it as a place of development and, as we said earlier, to remove any larvae from mosquitoes to prevent further pollution. Now, the lenient position. Rabelsky held that the Kensigo Reservoir has the status of a bore, meaning it has the status of a pit, and we saw in the Shulchan Aruch already that any water that comes from a pit, the insects that are found inside of it, is not considered problematic because it's not based on a natural body of water. Okay, furthermore, the Shulchan Aruch rules in Pei Daled Daled that if an insect died while it was still mutar and only then left its habitat, it is still permitted. Meaning that if you have the insect inside of the bore, right, and then it died, and then only afterwards it left, it is still permitted. If it left its habitat, and when it left its habitat it was alive, and when after it died, it becomes forbidden.
Not like your tequila bowl, yeah?
Okay? So again, Malan held that if the thing died while still in its natural habitat, it becomes permitted throughout, even if it's removed. So we said earlier, the source for it is in Halachot Daled. Basically, he brings a Yeshomrim from the Rambam. The Rambam is a Dat Yachid on this. He's a sole opinion that holds that any insect, even if it died if it died and then afterward it was removed, the Rambam held it's Asur. Maran brings that as a Yeshomrim, but we don't follow this opinion, and we do hold that upon separation, if it already died, it's still considered permitted. So if that's the case, since the copepods die prior to leaving the reservoir, because we said there's chlorination, also UV light that's being provided and treated, the reservoir, so we find that the reservoir visibly looks like a pit, since one would not be able to tell the water is leaving from the pipes buried underneath. And there's no issue consuming the water along with its insects, because since the insects are already dead by the time it leaves, and the thing visibly looks like a pit, therefore it leaves a pit already dead. Shulchan Aruch already said that is permitted. And this position is supported by the Pri Chadash and Pei Daled Bet, who states that even large lakes which contain stagnant water has the status of a bore. Basically, it's the reservoir in Kensigo would have the status as well, based on the understanding of the Pri Chadash. So the Shidra position, those who go against this position say the following. They quote a halacha in Halacha Bet of the same Siman Yerodea, which says, so the translation is mine. I hope I did a good job translating it, but this is essentially what it says. Regarding insects which develop in a body of water as a ditch which does not connect to a water source, yet is still flowing. So if it doesn't have a natural body of water that's actually connected to it directly, but it still flows afterwards, basically there's an opening that allows it to go, he says there are those who permit it, there are those who forbid it, right? Really, there's those who forbid and there are those who permit it. So now, basically what's happening in Kensigo is as follows. We said that there's water that's collected over there. It's a reservoir, it's essentially a pit. But there are valves. The valves are opening on a daily basis, and we said 1.45 billion gallons are leaving on a daily basis, which is about 4% of the total water volume. So seemingly this should have the status of these charitzim, where these ditches in which water is still flowing. So the question is, how do we paskin? Does the Malan paskin l'chumra or l'kula? Does he say?
Do we have the stam and we have the yesh?
Right. So the question is, do we go like the lenient opinion or the stringent opinion of Malan? So generally speaking, we say when there are two yesh opinions in the Shulchan Aruch, yesh v'yesh, the halacha usually follows the latter opinion. So if you look at the halacha, the latter opinion is the yesh material. There are those who say it's mutar. So therefore, you would say that really it should be permitted, even though it's still flowing out. And that's a general rule. However, the Shach quotes the Marshal that the custom is to be machmer. The custom is that even though we generally go by the last yesh, and in this case it should be matir, the minhag is to actually be machmer in this case. The same thing is brought by the Kafachim, and he said it's basically verbatim that although we generally follow the latter opinion, which is the halacha ki yesh patra, we're nonetheless machmer here as well. And this seems to be the opinion of most Achronim, that this is a situation in which it does not follow the general rules of stam v'yesh or yesh v'yesh ki yesh patra. So, if that's the case, Rav Badai and Rav Shachter held that the Kensigo Reservoir has the status of a ditch. Why is that? Because the water settles in the reservoir and therefore cannot be seen to be connected through a body of water. although 98% of its water is supplied by various aqueducts, meaning at a juncture. But basically, since it settles over there, we don't see it as actually being connected to the reservoir, the aqueducts that supplies it from Delaware and Catskills and Corsica. Nonetheless, since the water is leaving the reservoir through the valves, it cannot be considered the halachic equivalent of a pit, regardless of whether we actually see the water leaving or not. Because Rav Doskin's position was, if I look at it, it looks like a pit because the water level is not decreasing. However, the argument is, we don't care whether you see it or not. If the reality is that there are valves opening and closing it, that is considered what's known as moshchim. It's taking the water out. That is considered sufficient enough to be considered as if it is asur. That's their position. Okay. Last one, frequency of presence. How often does something have to be presented for the Torah to be asur? What is considered frequent enough for the Torah to say that we are posing a halachic problem? So now, there are three levels of infestation. Number one, muhzab Tola'im. Experience has shown that a certain food during a particular season and place, this is the explanation of the Shach, is likely to contain infestation in a majority of samples. Basically, if you have any type of fruit or vegetable in which 51% of the time or more there's going to be insects that are found over there, it's called muhzab Tola'im. And the necessity to check for those types of insects that found in that produce is a din d'oraita. You must check them because most likely it's actually there. The second level of infestation, slightly lower, miut hamatzoi. Basically meaning a significant minority of samples in a particular food is expected to contain infestation. It's less than 50%, but there is a good likelihood that it's still there. Now, from the Torah's perspective, there's no necessity to check. There's no necessity to check a food in which only a minority of the times is insects found over there. If you take a random vegetable, and you know that this type of vegetable in this place in this season, in more likelihood will not have it, from the Torah's perspective, there's no need to check. It's a din d'Rabbanan that requires you to do so. Okay? Finally, there's what's known as miut she'ena matzoi, which basically means an experience has shown that only an insignificant minority has proven to be infested. Basically meaning that if it's like 1 in a million times that this thing ever has a bug inside, we're not concerned with that, and the person doesn't need to check it. Obviously, it's good to check. The Chaya Adam says that he's been saved many times, possibly Isur, because he did check nonetheless. But even Midin D'Rabbanan, it's not necessary to do so. The question is, what is considered sufficient enough of the time for it to be considered a Din D'Rabbanan? So there are pretty much three opinions of what this goes. There's the more Mekel one, there's the more Machmer one, and the bottom. The Mekel one is from the Rivash. He writes in Siman Kuf Tzadi Aleph that if anything is slightly shy of 50% of the time, that's considered miut hamatzoi. Which basically means if you have a vegetable which is 40% of the time is there bugs inside of there, therefore there's a din d'Rabbanan to actually check it. But if it's only there 20% of the time, you don't even have to check it at all. You don't have to check it at all. So it's a huge kula because there are many fruits and vegetables over there that aren't that common. You know, there aren't 40% of the time in which a person needs to actually assume that there's any insects inside. So what he's saying is a tremendous kula because that would remove the necessity to check almost everything on the market, right? Essentially. There's the next opinion, which is from the Mishkarat Yaakov, which says no, miut hamatzoi is 10%. If at least you have a 10% threshold, that is good enough from a D'Rabbanan to say that you must check it. You must check it D'Rabbanan if it's even only 10%. The most machmer opinion says, from the Shevet HaLevi, in his Tshuva and Pei Aleph, says that even if it's 0.5% of the time, meaning 1 in 200, that is again, that's a very machmer opinion. To say that even if insects come 1 in 200 samples, that is considered often enough for us to check it. Now, we take the middle approach. We're not as Mekel as the Rivash, not as machmer as the Shevet HaLevi. We go by Mishkarat Yaakov and say if the infestation is 10% of the time, we do assume that this is considered miut hamatzoi, and therefore there is a din d'Rabbanan to check it. The question is, 10% of what? How do we check 10%? 10% of each individual, 10% of a whole bundle, 10% of a box. So what is going on over here? If you go shopping, you take 10 apples, right? And you find it in one of them, okay, we understand that's problematic because you got literally 1 out of 10. But if you have a whole box of them, how do you ascertain what's considered 10% of it? 10% of the whole thing, or is one box considered a whole unit on its own? It's quite questionable. So the way it goes is based on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's psak. He said that 10% is when you have a standard unit of that criteria. Basically meaning that if you have, 5 heads of lettuce is considered a standard unit based on the way it's sold. if you have 10% of the time, I don't know, 10 heads of lettuce, would it be considered a standard unit, and you only find one of them, in one head, that would be considered sufficient enough to actually check it. If it's less than one head per 10, therefore it would be less than the threshold of 10%, and therefore there's no necessity to go. So, question is, regarding water, what is considered the standard unit? And most American kosher organizations say that it goes based on the gallon. So if you have one copepod in every gallon, or in every 10 gallons actually, that would be considered sufficiently presentable for it to be considered as a concern. So one copepod in every 10 gallons, according to the Mishkan Yaakov and based on Rosh Hashanah Auerbach's psak, would be considered sufficiently noticeable and frequent enough to pose a concern. Now, what is the reality? How do we understand it? So, depending on which part of New York City a person is residing, that would affect the amount of copepods that are present in the standard unit of measurement. Some places have up to 10 to 15 insects per gallon. Others are far more clean, in which they would not be even in 20 gallons where you're going to find it. So, if that's the case, there's not even a mita mitzvah over there. It's less than the 10% threshold. So,
from what I understood, it also depends if they're mixing in the water that comes to the local wells into the water stream as well.
Right, and then don't forget as well that we said that it's 90% of the water that actually comes from Kensico. The other 10% is from the other aqueducts that actually doesn't end up in Westchester County. Mm-hmm. So you can say it's only 10%, it's not sufficient, but we're going to see there are parts of New York, smaller parts of New York that actually rely only on that water stream and they don't actually rely on Kensico whatsoever. Where that is, if you look at the picture in New York City water system, you actually cannot see it very clear from here. You'd actually have to pay more attention. Let me see if I can zoom in. You guys see it better?
Yes.
Okay. So now it gives the color coding. Tunnel 1 is in the teal color. Number 2 is in purple, and the orange is number 3. So if we look at the Croton Aqueduct, which is the one that bypasses Kensico, and it's the one that does not contain copepods, we see it doesn't go with the Catskill of Delaware on the 2 to the right, but we see it transverses the Bronx, and it goes until, I guess what you call the northern part of Manhattan, probably like the Upper East Side. Those portions of the Bronx, the Upper East Side, they don't get any copepods whatsoever because they don't go through Kensico. But if you look at the other ones from Catskill and Delaware, which do end up in Kensico, you see they go through the Bronx, they end up in Queens, they end up in Manhattan, they end up in Brooklyn, Staten Island as well. So the vast majority of New York City does end up over there. But again, the presence of copepods not only depends on whether it goes to Kensico or not, it also depends on how much there is in the given gallon. It could be a number of factors, as the Rav was saying. Maybe the other water wells are there. Maybe it goes on with other aqueducts that are being merged. So there are a number of factors that are involved. And it's not only Dafka, if it comes to Kensico, it's problematic. Even there, even though it has 90%, there are other issues that a person has to take into account before you can say the thing is usher itself. So Rav Belsky held was that if you take a total average of everything, he says the copepods appear less than 10% of the time, which basically means less than one copepod in every 10 gallons, and therefore you do not meet the threshold of the 10%. It's not a miut hamatzui, it's what we call miut she'eno matzui, and therefore he held if you take the total average of all New York, therefore it does not pose an issue. You might live in a neighborhood in which it would be more frequent, but since we take it as a whole, therefore it's not frequent enough, and therefore it is considered permitted, and that's how he held. The dissenting opinion, however, is what the OU bases on. It's based on Rav Schechter's psak. He rules that since with proper instruments, again, this becomes problematic because once you're bringing tools into the equation, it becomes somewhat obscure because usually we say that the Torah only forbids things that's with the naked eye and not with tools because tools is a man-made invention and the Torah is not really concerned with man-made inventions to that extent. So his argument was that since with proper tools, copepods are able to be found in more prevalent numbers, it is considered a miut hamitzui. He did hold, and this is based on how the OU actually paskins as well, most kosher organizations paskin as well, that the following 3 are true. Copepods are visible to be considered significant. Basically, even though you cannot discern them, but you could see them, and once upon a time when they were still in Kensico, they were at least discernible by their movement, that is considered to be sufficiently problematic. The second thing that they agree on,
which goes along with Rosh David.
right, so that's their position. Another thing that they agree on, the reservoir where it develops is not considered a bore because they hold the valves that open it does not have the status of a bore, but rather it's considered like those ditches in which it constantly has the flowing water. And number 3 in which they agree is that the frequency of its appearance is considered miyut hamatzui, which basically means that since it passes that 10% threshold, all these three criteria are met, and therefore it does pose a problem. And if it does pose a problem, what could be done? So the OU's position, I'm going to read everything over here. It's about basically a 5-point thing, in which it says that the tap water in New York City should be filtered before drinking by using filters rated at 50 microns. Basically meaning that if you have a filter in which each portion of the mesh over there is 0.05 millimeters, which basically means the following. 0.05 millimeters is extremely small because we said that the adult size of a cold pot is what? Anyone remember?
1 millimeter.
Right, anywhere between 1 to 2 millimeters. 0.05 millimeters, basically you're taking one thing and you're dividing it into 20 parts essentially. So for it to fit into such a small thing, it would be impossible. It's like basically if you take a person who's like 6 feet tall and you're basically making a hole that's like 2 inches large. Okay, that's like try to fit inside of that. It's not going to happen. Now, what's most interesting is that even though it's so much smaller, it doesn't have a 100% efficacy rate. It's only 85%. Somehow, maybe it would be the smaller ones, maybe the larva actually ends up inside of it, and the question is whether the larva is considered bria or not, but nonetheless, they're small enough to actually transverse through those things, so what? It's only 85%. Therefore, they say that if you could get a smaller one, they have things that are only on the 10 micron scale, which they say would completely remove everything, because even those smaller ones cannot go through them. But that's only a chumrah. Even according to them, who say it's a problem, they say that 50 microns is sufficient enough to get at least most of them. And even since you get most of them out, it will only be a miyut she'enu matzui, and that based on that, they say it would not be an issue. Now, other things they say products already manufactured could be used, like unfiltered water. They also agree that if a person is using the water not for consumption, but rather for cooking, that's not a problem, because when you cook the water, we assume that everything is going to be, all the insects are going to disintegrate, they're going to melt inside, and therefore it's going to be bottled to the whole pot itself. There's no issue whatsoever. And there are other things as well regarding Halachot Shabbat and Yom Tov regarding filtering, and bottled water is permitted for use. Rav Belsky, interestingly enough, was opposed to filtering completely. And it's based on an interesting psak that he has. It's a very interesting take how he takes it. Because you could say, okay, according to Rav Belsky, okay, fine. So you hold that there is no problem with the water itself, right? Because the cold pots apparently pose no issue. However, what's the problem if a person just places a filter? Is that problematic? I mean, why is it an issue? Just place a filter, you'll be yotze according to all the opinions, right? If I'm concerned for Rav Belsky and I'm concerned for him, just place a filter. I'll fulfill all opinions. According to Rav Belsky, however, he says if you make a filter, you're actually making the problem worse. You're making the problem worse, and what was once permitted now becomes forbidden. Why is that? Because Shulchan Aruch says in Peidal Halacha Gimel that if you have a filter, okay, basically if you have a filter and you're placing water through the filter, now some of the bugs get lodged inside of the filter, right? But there's a concern that if you're still leaving the cup of water underneath the filter, maybe one of the bugs is going to be dislodged from it and fall back inside. So what we said earlier was that if a bug is inside of the water that was in the container, it's permitted as long as it's in its environment. Once it leaves its environment, even if it goes back inside, like we saw in Halacha Aleph, it becomes forbidden. So here's what happens. If you have the cold pot that's permitted from Kensico, now it goes and travels through all the aqueducts into your sink. Then there's a filter, right? Now in the filter, it gets dislodged. Now all the water comes out, it's dislodged, and it's basically stuck inside of the filter. Now this insect becomes forbidden, right? Because it's no longer in its environment. But since somehow there's a concern that maybe it's going to be able to get out of it because there's only an 85% efficacy rate, since it's only 85%, there's a 50% chance, which is 1/6 of a chance that it might fall back inside, and therefore the permitted insect now becomes a forbidden insect because it goes back inside its environment. Wow. We already saw going back inside its environment is an Isur. Therefore he says if you want to use a filter, you're actually getting into much bigger problems. But it seems to be the case that if you're going to be using a filter in which there is no chance for it to come back, because we said the 50 micron is 85%, but if you're using something much smaller than that, it would solve that problem as well because there's no chance for it to come back.
How long do you have?
It's one more slide.
Okay.
That was his point. So he says that filtering the traps would basically cause an issue afterwards. In conclusion, many kosher establishments have filters for the tap water in deference to the opinions of those poskim who take a stringent approach. We saw Rav David Feinstein, Rav Elyashiv, and Rav Schachter from the OU.
YU.
Right, OU and YU.
Yeah.
So now, individuals are encouraged as well to install a suitable filter to substantially remove the copepods, which have 85% efficacy. The need for a filter is not necessary when the water is going to be boiled, as the copepods become dismembered and therefore bottled to the mixture. However, the final point, those who don't install a filter, have a posek on exceptional caliber as Rav Belsky to rely on. Thank you very much.
Chazak Baruch.